That was an amazing first dialogue, and I'm so honored to be among this crowd. So our second dialogue is Shakespeare in the Archives 2050, and our moderator is Michelle Dowd. I am meant to remind you that there's no eating or drinking except for water in the auditorium, so don't bring your snacks in here. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to Michelle. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Hannah, and thank you for all of you again for being here. It's my true honor to be able to moderate this panel for this afternoon. I'm really looking forward to continuing these conversations from this morning. You'll notice some similarity in the kinds of questions, which I think provides a nice continuity between our various sessions over the next day. So let me begin by introducing our three presenters today. Jill Gage has worked at the Newberry Library since 2004. Since 2016, she has been custodian of the John M. Wing Foundation on the history of printing and bibliographer for British literature and history. She holds a PhD in English from the University of London and an MS in Library and Information Science from Illinois. She has published on a variety of topics, including the extra illustrated books of John M. Wing. She has also curated a number of exhibitions at the Newberry, including a show of hands, handwriting in the age of print, up through the end of December, which explores the relationship between handwriting and print from the 16th century through the present day. She also curated the 2016 exhibition, Creating Shakespeare, which explored Shakespeare's own creativity as well as his 400-year afterlife, surveying the writers, printers, actors, artists, musicians, audiences, readers, and scholars who published, performed, adapted, appropriated, transfigured, and collected him, creating him anew for each successive generation. Michael Witmore is the director of the Folger Shakespeare Library, and he was appointed as the 7th director of the Folger on July 1st, 2011. He was formerly professor of English at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and before that, he served as associate professor of English and assistant professor of English at Carnegie Mellon University. The recipient of numerous fellowships, he has held an Andrew Mellon postdoctoral fellowship at the University of California, Los Angeles, a research fellowship and a curatorial residency fellowship at the Folger, and a pre-doctoral fellowship at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin. He was awarded but declined an ACLS Digital Innovation Fellowship for the academic year 2011-2012. Dr. Witmore earned an AB in English at Vassar College and an MA and PhD in rhetoric at the University of California, Berkeley. He is a board member of the National Humanities Alliance and the National Humanities Center, as well as a lifetime member of the American Antiquarian Society. Karla Nielsen from the Huntington, unfortunately, is ill and could not be here today. But instead, we are really delighted to have Jonathan Hope with us for this panel. Jonathan Hope is professor of English and director of literature programs at Arizona State University. He was director for 3 iterations of the NEH Advanced Symposium in Digital Humanities, Early Modern Digital Agendas, held at the Folger Shakespeare Library. He serves on the User Advisory Board for EBO and EEB, that's Early English Books Online and Early European Books. With Michael Witmore, he has published numerous articles on the quantitative analysis of Shakespeare and early modern literature. Please welcome our panelists today. So we're going to get started with probably the most personal question, I guess, or the most anecdotal question of the afternoon, which is to tell us a little bit about your first experience with Shakespeare in the archives. Reminiscing perhaps back to our first panel, thinking about how old were you, what were the circumstances, but also how it maybe impacts your work now, that initial experience. Michael or Jonathan, would you like to get us started?
I'll start, and I I may not answer your question exactly, but it's very hard to go on a panel of archivists and librarians after a panel of artists and performers, because we really don't make people cry for a living. We have a strange and unique set of duties as people who lead or work in research libraries. It's connected to academia, but it's also part of cultural memory. And so I hope we'll be able to span those two poles. I'll tell you my first Shakespeare experience. It was when I was 15. I was raised evangelical Pentecostal, and that meant that we read the King James Bible after dinner every day. And I did my share of reading Paul's epistle to the Romans and many other biblical texts. Over time, I became less interested in the Christian tradition. You become a teenager and you decide you're a Marxist or something. And as I was going through high school, we read Shakespeare's Othello. And so I was 17 when I read that play. And I was bowled over by that play. In my own personal experience, it was being shocked at a play that asked the question, what will you do when you meet the one person who can tell you the lies that you cannot resist? And that felt like a very powerful question to me, and remains one for me, and I think it is one for our country. But the other thing that happened, which I do associate with Shakespeare, was it was kind of like a sneak attack, because I knew that language. The King James Bible was translated roughly within the same generation that Shakespeare was active as a writer. And so realizing that on some level I understood this language, but on another level it represented something totally different, made me feel that there's a power to books, and particularly old books, to help explain who we are, but also to sneak up on us. And that's been a recurring theme in my experience working in a rare book and manuscript collection. I will say that my first encounter with an early modern book was here at the Huntington. I was lucky enough to write my dissertation in the reading room here, and so I know it's changed a lot, it's expanded a lot, but it's a wonderful experience to come back and be part of this event.
Thank you. Jonathan?
So my first experience of Shakespeare in an archive was the first year of my PhD, which was at Cambridge, the real Cambridge in the UK. Now that I work in the States, I realize British PhDs work in a very unusual way, which is basically you get given a library card and pointed to the library, and they say come back in 4 years with a PhD. And I, being a dutiful PhD student, I thought, right, I'll go to the rare books room. So I went to the rare books room and I called up a Shakespeare First Folio, and they brought it to me, which you could do in those days. I don't think you can do it anymore. So I was presented with this book, and I kind of looked at it, and I thought, well, I better do something with it. So I opened it and tried to read it. And of course I couldn't read it because, it's not like I hadn't read Shakespeare. I'd been reading a lot of Shakespeare. But I was aware of the book as an object and a physical thing. And, the words, I recognized the words from having read them in Arden editions. But I could not describe that as a process of reading. And I think some of the issues that we'll talk about in relation to the archive, and especially in thinking about the archive looking forward to 2050, kind of just thinking this morning about this, I go back to that moment because I was faced with a physical object that was being preserved. You might think not very well if they're handing it out to first-year PhD students, but it was in theory being preserved by the Cambridge UL. And what was it being preserved for? It was, arguably being preserved for so that I could have that experience of a physical object rather than reading it. And interestingly, I actually ordered 2 books that day. because I wanted to work on the Shakespeare-Fletcher collaborations, so my PhD was on Fletcher as well. And I ordered the Beaumont and Fletcher first folio, which nobody wants to hear about. That's not. But that book, I actually did read, because at that time, and actually still to a large extent today, it was virtually impossible to read most of those plays in a modern edition. You had to either go to a rare books room and read the first folio, or, as I actually did for my PhD, buy a 19th century combined edition of Johnson, Beaumont and Fletcher. So my experience with those two physical objects, both in the archive, was actually very different. One of them I actually couldn't read because of the kind of symbolism around it and my experience, my familiarity with the text. But the other one, actually, it was what booksellers disparagingly call a reading copy. Because if I wanted to read those plays, pretty much that was one of the easiest ways for me to read that book. So two different texts that I was responding to in a very different way. And I think, in terms of what I think I'll say later on, we'll keep coming back to that distinction. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Do you want to say just a bit at the moment about how you think that initial experience affects your thinking now or your work now? I mean, Michael kind of touched on it.
Good question. I think I was so kind of naive in those days that, and I thought, yeah, of course I get access to first folios. You know, you go to a library, they give you the books. But I suppose one thing that was triggered was I decided I wanted to work on Beaumont and Fletcher. Here I was, one of the major universities of the world, and it was difficult to read those plays. They were accessible as long as you had a reading card and they let you in and they thought you looked okay. But you know, these were not that obscure in terms of plays, but it was hard for me to get access to those plays, and that's something that is different now.
Great, thank you. And Jill?
Can I have my slides, please? Yeah, I'm like a prop comic. I always need something. I joked before that curators are like exhibitionists. We always need like, something to show. I have a two-part answer to this question, neither of which I think actually responds directly to the question. My first experience, and I'm going to cheat a little bit because the first thing I thought of was not my experience in an archive, but in a bookshop with Shakespeare. And just to give you a bit of framework, I hated being a child, and all I wanted to do was like sit with adults and drink coffee and smoke cigarettes and read the newspaper, which in retrospect, I think maybe I just wanted to be French. But I rejected anything like children's literature, young adult literature. And so this is a story about the first time I had money and bought my own books. So I'd received money for my birthday, and I asked my mother to take me to Walden Books in the mall. And I walked around for a really long time to pick which books I wanted. And I didn't want anything like young adult. And so I would walk around and pick things up and read the covers very carefully. And I ended up buying two books, one based on the illustration on the front cover, and one based on the blurb on the back cover, which called the book, the quote, "the greatest shaggy dog story ever told." And my thought, I like dogs, this must be a book about a shaggy dog. The books turned out to be Midsummer Night's Dream and Tristram Shandy.
My Lord.
Which has a great Shakespeare reference in there. And Midsummer Night's Dream had fairies on the cover and was blue. So I took these books home. I was 10. My mom was like, "You are the weirdest child I've ever met." I couldn't read the books. I tried to. I realized I don't even think there's a dog in Tristram Shandy. Weirdly, these two books, authors Shakespeare and Lawrence Sterne, followed me throughout my life. Like I've been obsessed with both of them, perhaps because I couldn't read them when I was 10. But I tell this story because, and this is important to me in my work as a curator, my first experience was about being a consumer. It was about the materiality of the books. And for me, that has never changed. it's no coincidence that I'm a curator of the history of printing, and I'm interested in makers and what books have looked like over time. And so when I was in high school and then undergraduate, I was the kid who was obsessed with the first folio and the quarto. Like, why did they look that way? Who made them? Why do they look different? Who is making these choices? Why does the type look that way? Why is the S that way? And the teacher would be like, look, we're talking about the plot of Romeo and Juliet. And so for me, the materiality was just as, if not more important than the text. Possibly is why I'm a librarian and not a scholar. So when I came to the Newberry in 2004, I was very hardcore, like 17th century, like the quartos, the folio. These are the books that tell the story of Shakespeare. And when I would do presentations, that's what I'd pull out. And if I wanted to be like a little racy, maybe I'd pull out some restoration quartos, like the Nahum Tate Lear or something. And I thought I was, like, wow, I'm forging new fields. And a couple years after I started, I was asked to do a half-day seminar for high school teachers on using special collection or primary sources to teach Shakespeare. So I pulled out my usual stuff, and I thought that I would investigate a little bit more. And I pulled out some things like theater programs from the 19th century. So here we have young Rossius and Mrs. Glover as Hamlet. So young Rossius was actually a child actor named Master Betty, so like 12 or 13. Mrs. Glover is obviously a woman. I thought this was really weird and strange, and we have a huge collection of theater programs here at the Newberry. And I thought it was fun, but this is supposed to be, I thought, like a palate cleanser for these teachers. Like we would spend like the morning, like we're gonna look at quartos, and then we'll take a break and look at these. And then we have a collection of about 150,000 pieces of sheet music at the Newberry, and I found a whole box marked Shakespeare. We have things like Edwin Booth and When Mr. Shakespeare Comes to Town. At the same time, I was like, again, these are really fun. So these teachers came in and we started talking, and they spent, I'm not kidding, maybe 5 minutes looking at the folio, and then the rest of the time asking me questions about the theater programs and the sheet music. And the first part of the day, I kept thinking, like, they're getting this wrong. Like, they're looking at the wrong thing. And at lunch, I said, just out of curiosity, why are you so interested in the later material? And they said, we all teach Huck Finn, and we can use this, like the Duke and the Earl, and this speaks to something like this is a hook for our students, and this is something we can actually use, and we like what you're showing us with the earlier material. That's really interesting, but we can't use that for our students. And this, to me, was like that moment, like that light bulb going off, like, okay, first of all, meet people where they are in the archive. And like, it's not about me forcing people to like what I think is interesting, but also there's so much, the Newberry's filled with fantastic things that can be useful to people. And I shouldn't stay here, I shouldn't set Shakespeare in amber when there's so much interesting stuff throughout. And throughout time, people have had the same experience that I did in that bookshop as a kid, like being excited about something because of the way that it looked or the way that it felt in their hands or it attracted them. So why don't I lean into that and explore Shakespeare in the archive much more broadly? So this was just a real moment for me. That's it.
That's fantastic. Thank you. Yeah, and actually I think that leads, it might segue us into the next more a broad question about talking about, in the case of you and Michael, of like the collections that you oversee, but thinking about your relationship to the Shakespearean collection, and like if you could just sort of describe to us a little bit, kind of the Shakespeare collection that you have, and when did you start? We kind of said a little bit about this in the bio, but what's your experience working there? But do you have a favorite? We asked the theater practitioner about a favorite moment. Do you have a favorite moment, sort of in the archives or working with the materials that the three of you have worked with? Jill, did you want to continue on from what you were?
I can go. I mean, you work at the Folger Shakespeare Library, so you've got a lot of moments.
Well, that's a hard one. I'll tell you a story about something that happened that I found interesting. It's not exactly Shakespearean, though. We had an exhibition on the law, And as you may know, the Folger collection, it has some Shakespeare, but it's actually vast. It covers many different aspects of the Western European world and the Atlantic world from about 1530 to 1700. And we did an exhibition on the law, and because we're next to the Supreme Court, we're physically located on Capitol Hill. The Chief Justice came over with his team, and the Chief Justice is a very highly guarded person with often surrounded by people in trench coats with weapons. And he saw the exhibition, he really enjoyed it, he was very curious, his clerks were very curious. And our reading room is right next to the exhibition hall. And so I said, Mr. Chief Justice, would you like to see our readers and our scholars who are working with materials that are 300 and 400 years old? And I thought he would be busy and go away, but he said, oh no, I would really like that. And so it's quite intrusive to come into the reading room from the Great Hall. So the doors kind of blow open and 12 people walk in, including the Chief Justice and these armed men. And we just stood there and not a single person looked up. And I turned to him and I said, this is probably my proudest moment as director, because we do not matter to these people. They're taking that deep dive. They are using their imaginations, their knowledge, their passion to try to understand some kind of truth that is buried in the past. And I particularly like that story because we are living through a period that is very anti-expertise and is rightly critical of the exclusivity of scholarly institutions, libraries. As you can tell, this is probably will be the least diverse panel of the ones that appear here. But this entire tradition is extremely conservative, and since the Middle Ages, libraries and higher schools, cathedral schools, were given special privileges, which allowed them to operate the way that they wanted. And that's where academic freedom comes from, and that's very important. But those institutions are also part of a history of not only exclusion, but of active exclusion. So in the case of my institution, when the Folger opened up in 1932 and the president came, President Hoover came, the then director of research said, we're so glad to open this building, and one reason why we're here is to protect the purity of Anglo-Saxon culture, which is threatened now by unrestrained immigration. So it doesn't get clearer than that. That is the softer form of white supremacy, that it's about policing how people get access to different kinds of cultural materials. And I think that institutions like ours, we have people who are truly passionate about understanding the past. It requires enormous patience to learn how to read handwriting that is 400 years old. It requires incredible resources and the privilege of time away to be able to do those things. I still believe, though, that expertise has its own dignity and it's important. And I'm not sure it deserves special privilege, but it deserves to be affirmed and supported. And the ways in which our institutions give people those opportunities, that needs to remain. But the opportunity to do those things needs to be experienced much, much more widely. And so I was happy to have this demonstration case of the passionate scholars being absorbed, but I also realized that I feel very strongly that expertise matters. I also understand that it's an extraordinary thing to have the time to walk into the UCL Cambridge Library and ask for a first folio and get one. So it's more of a tension than anything else.
We'll probably come back to some of those themes, I think, in some of the subsequent questions. Jill, do you want to?
Can you remind me what the collection
Yeah, so it's,
oh, the
maybe
collection.
tell us a
The
little bit more
collections.
about the
Okay.
collection at the Newberry and the Shakespeare collection in particular, and if you have a favorite collecting moment.
Yes. Okay, so again, I have a number of stories. I'm sorry. So the Newberry is an independent research library for the humanities, similar to the Folger and the Huntington. We're very broad. Our collection spans from the Middle Ages through the present day, mostly Western Europe and the Americas. And so it's similar to the Huntington's collection in many ways. And so we have 6 curators. And when we don't have a distinct Shakespeare collection. So if you come in and you say, can we see your Shakespeare collection? We don't have that. But we have Shakespeare throughout the collection, throughout every single collection in the library. And in 2016, when I was giving a lot of talks, I looked at my notes this past week. My general comment is that we have about 30,000 Shakespeare things related to Shakespeare, and people wouldn't even think of us as a Shakespeare library. And when I'm talking about 30,000 things, it ranges from those quartos and folios to references in novels to 19th century periodicals to maps, manuscripts, performing arts collections. But it's a huge number of things, and it's very difficult to get at them, and that's for some of those things. And so that when I was curating this exhibition in 2016, which started out about 2012 as a collaboration with the Folger and remained a collaboration, but in a different way than it started, I wanted to learn as much as possible about the Newberry's collections. Also, I kind of went down this dark rabbit hole. So anybody who spoke to me during those years, if you said, you were a scholar of the American Great Awakening, I'd say, tell me about the Great Awakening in Shakespeare, tell me about the French Revolution in Shakespeare. And people would always say at first, well, there's nothing to do with that. And then they would say, wait a minute, sermon culture was really big, and Shakespeare was really influential on sermons in 18th century America. Or Edmund Burke said that, if you'd read Shakespeare, you couldn't support the French Revolution. So I found threads everywhere. And I became fascinated with, Shakespeare in America, and that student who asked that question, I didn't like the notes in his Oxford edition. Earlier, I'd known he was going to leave, I would have told him that the first American edition of Shakespeare in the 1790s stripped all of the notes from the Samuel Johnson edition, and the editors literally said, American readers do not want to wade through that forest of criticism. Samuel Johnson would be rolling over in his grave to know that got imported to America. So I went to every single colleague I had at the Newberry and said, tell me about Shakespeare in your collection. And they would start out by saying, I don't know, what are you talking about? And so my favorite things were always the things that I just was like, what, we have that? That's crazy. Including this was from a collection of Western Americana. This was a boy at 12 years old who made up this fake evening of Shakespeare. It was one evening, and it was Richard III, Macbeth, and Hamlet, so it was a long night. And so this is 1863. So again, first of all, in the middle of the Civil War, this boy in Ohio is putting on this fantasy evening of Shakespeare with Mr. and Mrs. Rhubarb were in all of the plays, so I'm not sure if these are his neighbors. This is in our collection of Western Americana because the next year his family moves to the Montana Territory. At 16, he prints the second book ever published in Montana. He printed at a newspaper office, and this little playbill is folded up inside our copy of that book, which is the reason that it survives. So I was completely interested in I work on young boy writers. That sounds really creepy. So this is our Western Americana collection. We have huge manuscript collections related to Chicago history and performing arts. And so our curator said, what's interesting is Ruth Page, who is a great dancer based out of Chicago, great character dancer, in the 1930s, she created the costumes and props and dances for 3 Shakespeare heroines, Juliet, Catherine from Taming of the Shrew, and Lady Macbeth, and she filmed herself and then decided that she didn't want to ever dance them in public. We had films of these, And she wrote about it too. So she filmed herself in 1839. So for the exhibition, we actually had the films of her dancing these heroines, which had never been seen before. And then, so I found these things all throughout the collections, and every time I found something, like when I found this, I thought, or when my colleague showed me this, I thought, I don't know the history of Shakespeare in Chicago. Like, how much, there's so much, and there's such a gap there, there's such an avenue for the Newberry, and why don't I know the history of Shakespeare in Chicago? This is totally fascinating. And so I went to see a donor who has a huge collection of Chicagoana, so he collects everything Chicago, and he has since made a bequest of his collection. He's made a bequest to the Newberry, so his collection will be coming to the Newberry, probably not for a while. But I said to him, "Okay, what do you have that's Shakespeare related?" And at first he said nothing. Jill, I collect Chicago. Why are you asking me about Shakespeare? And I was like, "Oh, come on, you have to have like early theater, like something." And he was like, "Oh, I have this," and he pulled out this bound collection of theater playbills from McVicker's Theater in Chicago in 1862, and he said, "I think this might be useful to you." And I opened it, and the first playbill was John Wilkes Booth as Othello in Chicago in 1862, and I was like, what the hell is this? Like, how do I not know about this? How has nobody worked on that? Yeah, of course. Yeah, he was very dramatic. Like, he knew what my reaction was gonna be. And I was like, so I ended up finding like reviews of this in the Chicago Tribune, and I was like, how am I not using this all the time? Like, how is this not the thing that I talk about? And there's a lot to unpack on this, I will say. We can talk about it later. But sorry.
There's like an artifact.
I became so fascinated, and I really thought, like, this is the avenue that I want for first of all, these are all these moments of understanding what the Newberry's collections were, seeing what and the funny thing is, the really amazing Chicago stuff in the exhibition I borrowed from the Folger, but also realizing, and I'll talk about this as we go forward too, because I think part of the Newberry strategy now in collecting Shakespeare and thinking about it, and more of our strategy as a whole, is thinking about the community that we live in and the community that we serve. And so thinking about archiving and documenting that history, the present, and the future of Shakespeare in Chicago is a way in which, we don't need to be a different institution. And if you're going to study like early books, you're probably not going to come to the Newberry. If you do, that's great. We have this stuff, but I wouldn't say
we have this stuff.
Well,
that's always the first selling point.
We have some stuff, but there are other libraries that do that better. And one of the things that I've learned as a curator is stuff should be where it should be. Like, does that make sense?
Sure.
When I started out, I would be like, and somebody during that run of that exhibition, or when we were preparing, somebody offered us like a fourth quarto of Hamlet or something, and it was like $250,000. And I was like, there was a time in my life when I would have thought the Newberry needs this. Sure. And then at that moment, though, I was like, you know what? We don't need that. And there are other things that I think I could buy. First of all, we didn't have that much money, but there are other things that we could buy. So my priorities changed over the period of curating. But we have a great collection. It's just a tiny fraction of it is used, and my job is to help people get into that and then rethink our collections.
Great, thank you. And Jonathan, do you want to maybe tell us a little bit about, maybe not your Shakespearean collections per se, but your work with Shakespeare in terms of digital materials, and that's work with the archives, and if you have a favorite moment sort of in your work so far that you'd like to share?
Yeah, so I don't run a library, thank goodness. But I was involved with a very large digital project, which was building from probably, I think, the most significant humanities project of the first half of this century, which was the Text Creation Partnership, which was a project to transcribe not all, but a very, very large number of the printed texts that survive from the early modern period. So those texts had been photographed in a project that began in the Second World War, and is actually still going on. And the photographs were available. Digitized versions of the photographs could be viewed and can be viewed quite widely. But there was no way to search those photographs because the text was pixels. So ProQuest and a consortium of American universities got together, and British universities, and paid for people to sit and transcribe those texts. A very interesting process that we could talk about if you want. But I was involved in a project which was trying to find ways to make those texts available to a wider audience. So, you know, you could get a zip drive of all of those 300,000 texts.
Yeah, it's a billion words.
Yeah, a billion words. You could get a zip drive of that and put it on your laptop. But good luck trying to do anything with it, because all the files have just got numbers for names. So we were trying to make it more kind of user-friendly, and one of the things that we did, was I was responsible for curating a subcorpus of that, which was everything that we want to call a dramatic text from the period, which turned out to be actually 1,500 texts. And part of the process for that, I spent about a year working with an RA to put dates and metadata on each of these files, so that people could actually do something sensible with it. You know, show me all of these plays in the order of, well, putting a date on a play is really problematic. Each one of those files has 6 dates attached to it. It's date of writing, date of first performance, date of publication, and so on and so on. And sometimes you don't even have a single date for them. But anyway, we're supplying metadata, which is something that librarians do, and is really important because otherwise the materials are invisible. But we were also trying to put the files together into groups that were useful. And Mike and I had actually already been working on Shakespeare for quite a long time, and we had been using as electronic text the Folger electronic texts of Shakespeare, which are fantastic texts. They've been really, really carefully edited, looked over, really put it in very carefully modernized, so they're easily searchable. So really good text. I mean, Shakespeare always has the best texts. But when it came to doing our corpus of 1,500 dramatic texts from the period, we did not use the fantastic Folger digital text of Shakespeare. We used the slightly crappy Text Creation Partnership texts, which were, verbatim transcriptions of the text that were transcriptions of digital files of photographs. So there's a series of transmissions. The photographs that the transcribers had to look at were like kind of photographs of photocopies. And so they were not good quality image files. And the transcribers were told very strictly, if you can't read a letter, don't guess. Just put this. They had a particular character that they used to indicate illegible. So those files are full of blanks. So in terms of quality compared to the Folger digital text, there's no question. I mean, they're hard to search because the spelling is early modern spelling. So if you're searching for a word, you have to think what are all the possible spellings for this word, and loads of the words are marked as illegible. So the amount of information in those texts arguably is much less. But we couldn't use them in our corpus because if we had put them in as Shakespeare, we'd have been putting our fingers on the scales, because the Shakespeare texts in the corpus would have been much better than all of the other texts. And one of the things we wanted to be able to do with our corpus was make comparisons between Shakespeare and everyone else, ideally, and find out why he's better. But of course, if you put a set of differently treated texts in as Shakespeare, you're kind of prejudging it, because you're going to find loads of differences which are to do with the fabricants that come from the text creation process. So we deliberately used worse texts than were available to us, which I'm sure to an archivist or to a scholar sounds like the worst possible thing you can do. But actually, I think it was, I learned a lot on that project. And one of the things was that, if you're doing something, and I think this was science, if you're doing something that's science, sometimes you end up doing stuff that's very counterintuitive to me as a literary scholar. Where there's this huge drive to, we must have the best text, we must correct all the text, we must edit the text to perfection. Sometimes, no.
Yeah. You want the noise.
You want the noise.
Yeah. You didn't mention that Shakespeare is incredibly normal and unremarkable.
Well, I was
Say something about that.
So the results of our work so far are, we can't find a reason why Shakespeare is better than everyone else.
You heard it here.
It's interesting to hear. One of the threads, I think, running through this last set of responses is very much about access, right, and equity to a certain extent as well, which I think might bring us to this, a sort of central question. I'd like to think a little bit, have you think through that issue of access, perhaps through this next question, about what conversations, you had in your library, your institution, after the Summer of Reckoning and the COVID closures, right, in 2020. What changes did your organization want and pledge to make? It sounds like some of the things you're discussing with access have been longstanding concerns, and I'm curious as to how that might have changed in the discussion, in the last 2 years. I don't know. Jill.
Can we just turn my slides off?
Oh.
My donor will be so delighted that his book has been up here, but we don't need to show. I'm going to be done with my slides.
We like your slides.
Great. Yeah. Thank you.
Sure. So that was a very complex, demanding period of time. So let me say a couple of things. One is I began to notice as director that there was a form of access that seemed to be well understood in libraries that looked like access but maybe wasn't. So one of the processes that happen within rare books libraries is that these fabulous items come in, they're bought, and of course that's the first decision. Who buys items and what do they think they're doing? Who do they think will read those items? So if you think of a parade of items coming into the institution, it turns out that in rare book libraries, the single most important factor for access is the metadata or the names that are applied to those items. And Adam and Eve were said to have named the animals in the Garden of Eden. So as these books and manuscripts are marching in, the catalogers are baptizing them with unique names and saying this is an indenture, this is a legal document, this is a 17th century dramatic text. And anyone who wants to find that text using an electronic database or the card catalog is strictly limited by what was said or not said. Now, one way to look at that is to say, well, we'd make our best guess, and over the next 100 years, we expect 25% of these items will be consulted based on the names that we applied. Problem solved. But there's a difference between planning for a horizon of just about anyone who might walk in, who might want something, and saying there are collections here that contain cultural materials that are extremely significant that we need to discuss. So in our case, a very important and sensitive material is a set of indentures from the 17th century, which look like they are agreements for apprentices, so teenagers who are they're giving up 3 to 5 years of their lives for training, or they're going across the Atlantic to do work in the colonies. But some of those materials, it turned out, were materials that were documenting not indenture and not voluntary apprenticeship, but enslavement. And the names of individuals that were written on those documents are the only trace of a person. If you're looking for traces of a person named William Shakespeare who lived in these years, you'll find them. But in libraries, to survive, you have to be noticed, and you must be named. And those are extremely important processes. And in addition to the internal cultural work that we've done, and I'm happy to talk about that, I think it's important for people who don't work in these types of institutions to understand that it is an interested process and sometimes a guess for someone to say, I think someday someone will want to see this document. And in the Atlantic history of colonization and the movement of enslaved peoples, people wouldn't think to come to the Folger for documents that are connected to that incredibly brutal and important episode in Western European history. You need to look for those traces of people. And, you know, I mean, honestly, it was heartbreaking and incredibly moving to see what was clearly a made-up name for a young boy that had been applied to this indenture, and just the sheer fact that it survived. Miracle number one. Miracle number two was that someone was curious enough to go through all of them with the help of curators who understood the collection and said, oh, you're looking for that? Have a look at these 20 documents. And so what I take from that is that access is actually an interested process. It's governed by decisions made by people with partial or limited knowledge, including a limited knowledge of what's relevant or a limited cultural experience. And that's why identity matters for staffs of rare book and manuscript collections. You may bring an incuriosity about a certain type of material. So that has to be built up. But it has to be active. And I think, you know, you didn't ask me to talk this long, but the process of forgetting and the threat of complete oblivion hangs over every collection. And the sheer fact of survival of a name, a signature, or a trace is one of the most precious things that we can hold on to. So unlike Prospero drowning his book, you know, which gives me the shivers, when a book disappears, so does a whole world. But there's an antagonist in this work, and it's forgetting. And the fact that certain people or certain experiences were deemed forgettable has meant that the way we name and talk about these items becomes incredibly important. And so that would be the thing, one of the things that I've noticed.
Thank you. Jill?
So I'll answer in a different way than Mike, although I think those are really powerful and affecting comments. The Newberry, and I think the story at the Newberry about the change in the way we think starts actually in 2019 when we got a new president at the library, Danny Green. Our previous president, David Spetafor, was great. He was a very, very traditional scholar. He'd come from a small liberal arts college, and he was an intellectual historian of 17th and 18th century Britain. So he thought about things in a very different way. And then our new president is Danny Green, who's a 20th century American social historian he'd worked at the Newberry, left, and he'd gone to the Holocaust Museum in DC, where he curated a big exhibition on the Holocaust in America. So he came to the Newberry came back to the Newberry in 2019, and there was an immediate sea change. He had different interests in the collections. He knew little about Shakespeare, which I thought was a problem. I'm kidding. He had a much different sense of who the Newberry's public was. And just as a reminder, the Newberry is open to the public, age 14 and older. All you have to do is come and show an ID. You can come in, you can look at whatever you want. If you say, I want the Shakespeare First Folio, we say, okay, sit down, we'll bring it out to you. There are no restrictions unless something is on exhibit or out of the building. And he started, he had a much different idea of who the public was and how we should engage with the public. And he had was very interested in the Newberry being more a part of the community in Chicago and also being a space where we could talk about these thorny issues. And so he also decided, for example, that there were no more niche exhibitions. So no more because you were interested in Friends of Samuel Johnson, could you just do an exhibition? I'm interested in Friends of Samuel Johnson. You can't just do an exhibition. And so he wanted exhibitions to ask questions of people. And so the example I've been giving is we would no longer do an exhibition just called The Tudors, but we would do an exhibition called Race Before Race, which is what will open next September. So there's a real turn, and it's not that the material's not different, the questions are different. And he wanted the Newberry to kind of face we don't have an especially problematic past, but he wanted us to sort of show the seams of the issues that were confronting us and not, we're founded by a bunch of rich white men in Chicago. And so let's talk about that and what that has meant for the library over time. Let's not try to shy away from that. And so then the library shut down and everything changed. So we even stopped, we halted collection development for a while, partially because nobody knew what was going on, but there weren't physically people in the building to take in and process these collections. And it was really every single conversation that we had for several months was, when are we reopening? Who are we reopening to? How long do we quarantine books for? So the collections kind of took a back seat for a while. What took a front seat was programming, right? How do we suddenly put everything online in virtual programs? And that is something that has continued. So hybrid programming is still it's going to be the future of the library. But we also stopped, and I'm sure every institution has dealt with this, we stopped somebody gets up and reads a really boring 90-minute paper, right? Because nobody's going to listen to that. And so that has totally reshaped. Well, this conference isn't people reading a paper.
Usually people read their paper.
So, and there's still a place for that. There still is a place for that. But that has really shifted the way that we've thought about programming and reaching people. And also, we have really just tried to be different, and every institution is doing this, but for this exhibition I have on handwriting right now, we had a program a couple weeks ago on the evolution of Chicago-style graffiti, in which we had people actually doing demonstrations of graffiti in our first floor space, which I can tell you the fumes were really bad. But it was one of the two best programs I've ever done at the Newberry. It was totally incredible, and we had a great response. The other great program was called Shakespeare, and we gave out free beer and had improv Shakespeare. But I think we have, it was incredible, it was very good. Though that kind of hybrid programming, I think, is here to stay in terms of just thinking about access, and I think that's been really important for us. We also rethought a lot of our digitization efforts during COVID, and I spent months and months just trying to pull together our resources that we had for students or people, who were trying to get things done in a time when we couldn't do that. And the other thing which we can talk about with the next question too, which is frictions, I think is, obviously we all started talking about, and these DEI initiatives had started in 2019 too with our new administration. How can we be more attentive to DEI issues both within the library staff, with programming, with collections, with readership, all of that. And so immediately everybody started thinking about DEI and collection development. And when I say everybody, not just at the Newberry, literally everybody. And I think that has brought up a lot of issues, some good and some bad, because we're competing, so everybody started competing for the same resources. So every institution is collecting DEI materials now. And that has, for example, driven the price sky high on things. And I think there is a lot to talk about in terms of what that means for cultural heritage, who's collecting, who has access to things, what are they doing it with when they buy it. So one of the ongoing conversations at the Newberry has been what are both our short-term and long-term ideas for this. We're priced out of the market on a lot of things right now. So what do we do? And collection development I'm not going to talk about it now because it's boring in some ways, but there are lots of moving parts to it, right?
It's hugely important.
And there are lots of funds and restrictions, and it's not just we have this huge pile of money that we do with what we want. So there are lots of maneuvering and conversations about it. And so, one of the things that we have, which I'm sure lots of institutions have the same thing, is sort of, we spent a long time during lockdown rewriting our collection development policies or talking about them and thinking about how we could shift both now and long term to acquire materials and what we would do with those materials once we get them, and how do they fit into the Newberry or how do they fit into the community, sort of really thinking through these questions instead of, and I think the access thing is a good one because getting the stuff is just it's the easiest step. It's the easiest thing, and if you have stuff that sits there and people can't get at it, you might as well not have it. And so it's not just a matter of getting stuff. Right. Yeah. So, but I think those are the questions: is how do we sustain what we want to do over time? Is a big question that we had. I wouldn't say it's a source of friction or fission, but it's like really big. It's the question that you can't just hash out over a 1-hour meeting. Right.
Yes.
You need 90 minutes at least. So.
It's not a single speaker. And I think we'll cycle back to some of these questions when we look forward as well. But Jonathan, do you want to say a bit about, the COVID closures, the summer reckoning, and how that affected the work you're doing?
Yeah. So again, I don't have a collection, but I am concerned with the way that digital texts can allow access, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how I think, especially early career researchers, have functioned with archives being closed. So eventually I'm going to talk about the way that non-physical access is important, but I don't want to imply that I don't think physical access to objects isn't important. It clearly is. There is marginalia. There are little kind of textual things that I love, that you basically have to be with a physical copy of the book to understand, and it's actually not just minutiae, and it's not just the very, very weird arcane things that only scholars get excited by. Jill talked about Tristram Shandy, which is a kind of book, is a book that I had right the way from undergraduate through to about 8 years ago. I had constantly tried to read because everyone kept saying, this is a great book, this is a fantastic book, it's so funny, you must read this book. And then also, actually, I mainly do Shakespeare, but I also teach a class on modern experimental literature. And Tristram Shandy, I genuinely think, is the most significant early experimental text. So, I really wanted to read this book. And I kept starting it. I have a Penguin classic that I bought when I was an undergraduate that is only, you can see where the bookmark is, and it's about a quarter of the way through. And I just couldn't do it. I just could not read that book until I saw, it was actually an online exhibition from Glasgow University's special collections, where they'd done an exhibition of their first edition of the book. And up until that point, despite having a PhD from Cambridge, the real one, I did not understand, I did not know that Tristram Shandy was published in 9 individual small volumes over the course of 6 years, basically 2 volumes a year. And I thought, oh my God. So I actually I was living in Glasgow at the time, I went to Glasgow University Special Collections and called up the 9 volumes of Tristram Shandy. And for the first time, I was able to read the book. Because the book is actually, but the physical experience of reading the book is so different when you read it as it was originally published. And Stern had been a typographer. He understood about making books, and a lot of the jokes in the book are about the physical qualities of the individual volumes. He keeps saying, oh, I'm about to tell you this story, but we're almost at the end of the volume, so you have to wait till the next one. Now that makes no sense whatsoever in the Penguin 600-page single volume, because it's it's on the next page. But for the original readers, not only did they have to put the volume down and pick another one up, but actually, when it was being published, they had to wait a year. It was like a periodical. So the whole, so my argument with Tristram Shandy is you cannot understand that text unless you experience the physical reality of it as it was published. And one of the best presents I ever gave myself was I bought myself the 9 volumes of almost all, not quite, there's kind of a mix, almost all first editions are a mix of the first 5 or 6 editions. And one of the great things about it, Stern physically signed 3 of the volumes, every copy of 3 of the volumes, because it was being pirated so much. He physically signed, so I have 3 Stern signatures. So, but that's just to say, sometimes the physical copy is not just telling you minutiae, it's giving you a very high level, rich experience of reading, which is you could not get from almost any modern edition of Stern. So that's the kind of my defense of physical access. The lack of physical access that we've had during COVID, I think it's not all bad, because the digital access to texts gives you a different kind of access. You lose out on a lot. There's huge amounts of stuff that you lose, but there are some things that you get. But some of it is made up, being able to read the text. But there are also things you can get from digital access that you cannot get from physical access. And I'm actually thinking of the work of a PhD student at ASU, Darius Rhymes, who's been working on the language that gets used in early modern texts to describe skin color. And she has been able to, using the Text Creation Partnership and EBO, she's been able to compare words across the whole 70,000 texts that are in the TCP corpus. Now, the fact that archives have been closed pretty much for the whole of her PhD has really been irrelevant, because even if every archive in the world had been open and that we had given Darius unlimited travel funds to go and visit them all, she would not have been able to make the level of comparison across different texts with the speed. I mean, she wouldn't have been able to do it at all, because nobody could do that physically, traveling around and trying to compare between 70,000 texts and doing searches. You suddenly think, oh, actually, this color word I need to use as well, or this other word I need to look at. So that is a kind of access. Well, that is access, but it's access in a very different way to the one we're used to thinking about, especially individual collections who are constantly, well, you're getting access to this particular book. And it's a kind of access that I don't think the subject area has thought through fully yet. But looking towards 2050, it is a question that scholars, and not just digital scholars and not just librarians, but everyone should be thinking, what does it mean to have access on that scale and in that way? What does it mean in terms of our ability to explain and understand the past? And how does it differ? Because, and one way to think of it, and this is a kind of weird conceptual leap, is that as a literary, someone who has training as a literary scholar, I'm trained to think about authors and books. So if I go to a library, I can use the catalogue because I look up in the catalogue under an author's name, or I look up a text. Those are the kind of entities I deal with. And that's how catalogues are organized. But one of the things that digital access allows us to do is to forget about authors and books and to think about words. So the archive, we think about it as a collection of texts by authors. Another way to think of it is it's a collection of instances of words. It's a massive, multi-dimensional, and you can, instead of looking at the career trajectory of an author, you can say, I'm going to track this word, and I'm going to track every occurrence of it in these 1 billion words in TCP. And that's the course of my research. And you can get access to that kind of track now. But it's a different way of thinking about research.
Yeah.
And I don't think we've quite got on top of it, but maybe by 2050 we will.
Yeah.
I wonder if, I'm keeping an eye on time and making sure we have time for these two last really big questions, but I want to give each of you a chance to maybe, if you want to jump off to the question about what bigger changes you would like to see in your institution or research library by 2050, but if there's anything you want to add about this most recent period, the COVID closures and this last 2 years, have there been conversations that you've had, in this recent period that are maybe prompting the way you think about what you'd like to see your research library, what changes you'd like to see by 2050 before we think about, an ideal vision of Shakespeare to conclude. But so maybe as a kind of combination of thinking about this current moment or the moment we're just kind of coming out of, and those bigger changes you'd like to see by 2050, if we can connect those two things. Yeah. Jill, do you want to start us?
Sure. That's such a big question.
I know.
As I mentioned before, it's always about having money to acquire things and then fund the projects we want to do with them. And I think we have thought and talked very carefully within the library, and I've thought about this. What are our priorities as an institution? And part of it for me has been saying, maybe my curatorial interests in Tristram Shandy, maybe that's not the most important thing for the moment. Deciding collectively, how are we going to spend our money? How are we going to spend pots of money that we have in thinking forward about, this makes it sound like we have tons of money. We don't. That's the issue. So I do, and I have pivoted in lots of ways. So I don't have the money to buy 17th century Shakespeare, nor would I probably did I have the opportunity. So for me personally, it's been pivoting and thinking about, so I work with a lot of contemporary book artists and bookmakers, and sort of thinking, I went around to people, and one of the things I bought a lot of was books that people made during COVID about the COVID experience, or even coming out of 2016. So I took down my slides, but I bought this book by Emily Martin, who's a book artist in Iowa, it's about King Lear, and she'd started making it after the 2016 election, and she said if Hillary Clinton had won, she would have done a book on Macbeth. But really thinking about how people experienced the pandemic and the Summer of Reckoning and the things that came out of that, and turn them into books and turn them into things. And it's something we've been interested in collecting in terms of modern manuscripts as well. So I have focused really on that. With creating Shakespeare, my exhibition, I did not want it to be about Shakespeare set in amber. And one of the takeaways I wanted for the exhibition is we are creating Shakespeare now in this moment in 2016. So I actually had commissioned a bookbinding for it, and I wanted people to think about how my whole exhibition was about how each generation has created Shakespeare for themselves, and what does it mean to look at that. So I wanted us in 2016 to not say well, now it's done, we'll just wait till the next anniversary. It's a moment to think about how we continue to create it. And I think, just to keep it on Shakespeare, that shift now, like at the Newberry, we have acquired the archives of the Shakespeare Project of Chicago, and we are in talks to get the archive of another theater group in Chicago, but it's very early, so I'm not at liberty to talk about it. So it really is, like, I think coming out of COVID, one of the things that Newberry has said is, like, and again, I don't think we are thinking specifically about Shakespeare, but it kind of, for this particular moment, it works out that way. Like, how are we collecting now? Like, let's kind of reframe what that is and how we can put, and that's just where our emphasis is going to be. Sorry, I'm going to stop there because I lost my way a little bit.
No, that's great. We can come back.
Sure. So I wanted to go back to the friction question. I can think of two areas that I feel, and I know that the staff feels. So the first is a turn towards inclusion means creating a friendly, welcoming space that positively and proactively invites people of all backgrounds, races, and beliefs into the institution. That means going into communities and creating or honoring existing relationships and being there as a place that can augment or amplify the hopes, aspirations, and conflicts of people in our immediate community. And I thought the first panel today was just marvelous at showing why that matters. In a culture that is a cloister, and I do think that there's an aspect of the Folger that is about deliberately withdrawing from society to a quiet room to think about something difficult or remote. And that's very important, to create those spaces for people to withdraw. In our case, it creates a question around levels of silence. So in our Great Hall, which is adjacent to the reading room, will be a public, welcoming social space with a bar and a cafe, and you can, sit there and write your love lyrics or chat with your book group. Right next door is the rare book and manuscript controlled reading space. And the expectations around silence are very significant. And people are, if you've been on the quiet car on a train, the quiet cars prove that people like libraries because people are very passionate about shushing each other. At one point I thought we need a curator of silence who would set the dial for how loud it could be in the reading room and several other spaces. And you want complete silence in your theater when the last word is said and it just lands. But okay, so inclusion means it gets noisier. How are we feeling about that? So that would be one area. A second, which is, I think there will be much discussion about, is that part of our plans in renovating our building is to create 5,000 square feet of exhibition and engagement space where there'll be a printing press, there'll be hundreds of rare books and manuscripts, there will be performance in these spaces. There'll probably be music from time to time. There will also be 82 first folios in a storage case that you can see into. And the execution of that, I do think it's important to take our very best collection, the one that is in effect the core of our collection, and to make it completely visible and accessible, to interpret it for people, to show how these books came to be, including getting a printing press in there and printing some of these books. However, it does look like an imperial treasure pile from a baron who collected it and who actually flouted antitrust laws to acquire a huge sum and then buy these books. So I think the question of what it means to put all of those books out there is very significant for us. And it's very significant too because the plays are being performed upstairs. And when we do the Henry Sixes and Jack Cade comes out and we are all thinking about what the country has been like for the last 5 years. I mean, the Folger was surrounded by federal troops after the insurrection. Out my window, I saw soldiers with long rifles and concertina wire day after day. And it was just an incredible demonstration to me, first of just how volatile and fragile our political situation is, but also, looking at that and seeing truly the failures of a liberal democracy on display. I mean, the thought would pass my mind sometimes, well, Shakespeare's going to be around a lot longer than American democracy. And we know that democracies fail and die. And the first Republican theorists of the Renaissance, Machiavelli and others, said, oh, the big problem is how will they end? But I think that's important because if you're saving these sources and using them to start a conversation, if the works are being performed on a stage one floor above, and if some of the members of that audience are people who make decisions about this country, it is extremely important to honor the fact that these words survive, but to emphasize that they belong wherever they feel right. I wouldn't insist that everyone loves Shakespeare or needs to read Shakespeare to be a good person. I think that's ridiculous. But some of that is still hanging around. I think for us it would be much more important to talk about, and here's 2050, it should be Shakespeare and. Here's an Everest, you can climb it, it's tough. We would love to talk about why it's tough. And it's very important to, internally there were also debates about, should we be leading with Shakespeare? Is he, at this point, so compromised, imperial history of Shakespeare, that we ought to just talk about something else? And I think there's probably still staff who feel that it's an embarrassment to talk first about Shakespeare. I disagree. There are now several generations of scholars, for example, scholars of color, artists of color, who have one hopes, ever increasing freedom to interpret and perform these works. And to say at that moment, this guy is radioactive, we better just put a cover on it, is just it's condescending in an incredible way. It is also important to acknowledge that there have been harms, exclusions, and unsafe spaces that were created with this writer. And I think we will have our greatest challenges in putting out those treasures and explaining why we've done it. And, for me, it's like, they could be seen as relics. You could just see it as a bunch of paper with leather. But I think every one of those books is a message in the bottle that's addressed maybe to us. And it's very powerful to see physical testimony to the existence of people, not just us, but people who wanted to read that book. And it's like a story that we look at and we want to see our names appear. And they never quite do. But that's a really interesting problem to have. And to be going around the district, which is, as we will be doing next year, and going to different communities and saying, well, Shakespeare had some friends who decided these plays ought to be preserved, and then they spent a lot of money and took some financial risk to create that book. What would you keep? What do you select for survival? What's on your playlist? What's that about? And there's tension everywhere, and there are also there are a lot of opportunities to make bad decisions around how to present the legacy of this incredible writer. That doesn't mean that we're off the hook. We need to say, as I'm looking at the concertina wire and thinking, my God, where are we going? Shakespeare needs to be a part of creating a multiracial democracy that includes many, many more people. And that needs to be in the mission statement of any institution that is presenting this work. That has to be part of the work. Also, the cultures of these institutions need to promote and create the kinds of spaces, as you were talking about earlier, where the most difficult questions can be asked, because Shakespeare's a really good person to argue with.
Can I just jump in? So I was thinking, first of all, how during this morning's talks, and we were kind of joking at lunch, like people don't get the same reaction from a rare book room than they do from like a performance of Shakespeare. And I was thinking...
It's a lot quieter.
It's a lot quieter. And there's also a sense of experiencing it with other people, and one of the issues around a reading room is you sit by yourself and read it, and you can't, you're not supposed to talk about it with other people, so you're kind of siloed that way. And I think creating these spaces where people experience the books together is really important. And even if you see people getting upset or reacting in certain ways, it's a really important space within the library, I think. And also kind of thinking about creating spaces, just dealing with the issue of this is what it means to be a reader, like at the Newberry. These are the barriers that are in place because we're a rare book library. So we say we're open to the public, but we have all these other barriers that people jump through. So how do they experience, and they don't know, I can just, you also have to tell us what you want. We'll give you anything, but you have to tell us. And so what do we do with people who don't know that? Like, it's not like you wander into a play and you don't understand it, but now suddenly you're experiencing Romeo and Juliet. There's not really that same experience in a reading room, which is what...
It doesn't wash over you.
It doesn't wash over you, which is actually a huge problem. People are always like, well, Shakespeare didn't emerge from the first folio, and tell me about it. So I think these exhibitions or ways in which the collections can be activated are really important for accessibility, and it's something we need to think a lot about for the future in the ways that it gets presented.
And Jonathan?
Yeah, I think, inclusion, it's one of those words that's impossible to argue against it. But I think it very often gets used, and then there's no kind of follow-on in terms of, okay, well, yes, inclusion's a great thing, but what are we going to do to achieve it? My institution, one of the things I love about being at Arizona State is that our charter defines us with the words, we're defined by who we include, not who we exclude. And our success depends on the success of students. And there's a genuine feeling that if a student fails to complete, it's our problem. And that, to some extent, we as academics have done something wrong, or not doing the job as well as we should be. And that's a very different mindset to pretty much every other university I've ever worked in. And they're serious about it. Which is, again, being serious about your corporate vision is very unusual as well in my experience. So I think if we want to do inclusion, I think you also have to do empowerment. And I think everyone was kind of really struck by the question we had in the previous session about notes. And one of the things I think notes are really interesting things. And one of the things that I was struck by was, actually, an awful lot of the notes and the additions that frighten people and exclude them from Shakespeare because they look at those notes and think, I can never get through all of that. But an awful lot of those notes are wrong. And I don't mean wrong in the sense that you could argue with them. I mean factually wrong. Yeah. Every single note on Shakespeare's astronomical theory is incorrect. And as someone who works on Shakespeare's language, I can tell you that most of the notes on, especially any note you see in an edition of Shakespeare that says Shakespeare is the first person to use this word, that's wrong. That's just wrong. So, and I think
this is expert knowledge, actually.
And but the good thing is, telling students that empowers them. Can empower them because they suddenly there's a space for them to work with the text. And actually, especially if they've got access to the OED and TCP, they can correct the notes very easily. So it's not that you're just saying, oh yeah, this is wrong, what are you going to do with it? They can actually be empowered to work with the text. And then even the notes that are correct are not fully correct because, and again, as someone said in the previous session, if you've got someone coming at a text from a different point of view and a different range of experience, they're going to be able to add to the text, add to the note. And we got asked, I'm going to answer the question about which Shakespeare play do you recommend teaching? Merry Wives of Windsor. All kinds of reasons. It's a fantastic play about economic transition from feudalism to early stage capitalism, for one thing. But actually, partly because the edition I use is the Folger edition with Paul Wehrstein and Barbara Mart's notes. And one of the great things about their notes in Merry Wives of Windsor is very frequently they say, "We have no idea what this means."
Yes, yeah, they said that.
Because there are so many old jokes in that play that are completely lost. Nobody knows what that play means. And telling students that and pointing them to that empowers them, because it's okay not to understand.
Thank you. We are just at the time when we should open up to questions from the audience. So I want to give
I was going to ask us too.
the mic over to anyone who would like to ask questions of our panelists. Right down in front here.
Yes, I have a
Just, we're passing the mic so that for the benefit of the online audience. Thank you.
Okay. I have a very simple question. I heard this mentioned a couple of times, and I just want a further explanation. Jonathan, I believe, you said TCP. What does that stand for, and where can I find it?
Okay, so it stands for Text Creation Partnership. And so that was the consortium that got together to transcribe the texts and make them available. So they're available in various locations. I would say the most accessible one is a website called Early Print, which is based at Washington University in St. Louis. And that's entirely free and open access. You can get access to all of the text through that.
And you mentioned a collection of plays that would be very difficult to find. I could find those on the TCP, the Early Print website.
So all of those plays are on that website, but they're not available as a kind of standalone corpus.
So individually, if I had a play, if I was looking for Woodstock, for instance, I could just put in Woodstock and find a copy of the play.
Yes.
Thank you.
Back here, yeah.
Hi, I want to first say thank you so much to all the panelists, both of this session and the previous one. This has been a really exciting conversation for so many reasons, but as someone who personally has a foot in both research institutions and arts institutions, I'm a scholar of early modern drama and Shakespeare. I also work professionally as a dramaturg and a theater producer, so I'm very much invested in both spaces, and it's so rare to see them come together, so this is very exciting. My question is kind of about this running joke that you all started with about the archives being maybe a less exciting place than the theater, which I think, like many good jokes, it's funny because it's kind of true. And it has so much to do, I think, with the fact that the experience of being in a reading room is very private, it's quiet, as you were saying, can be a very solitary activity, whereas theater is communal, it's public. Anyone in theory can walk in and buy a ticket, and hopefully sometimes with some of the work that these companies are doing, you don't even need to buy a ticket, or that is to pay money for a ticket. So my question is about the point of intersection between the two. What I would have loved to ask the previous panel before we ran out of time was how they intersect with scholarship as theater practitioners, and they kind of address that. So my question for all of you is how you see your work intersecting with performance. So, and I would particularly, this is to everyone, but I would particularly love to hear about the Folger, since there is a theater and a music consort in residence, and also Chicago, which has such a vibrant theater scene. Thanks.
Thank you for asking. So we've been performing the plays for almost 35 years in that space. It's a small space, so it's hard to make money on that particular 230-seat theater. The economics are already prescribed. But we have done things where scholars have come together with theater practitioners. So we did a version of Davenant's Macbeth, which is almost proto-operatic, and the Folger consort played. The scholars came and talked about the original conditions. The artists interpreted them, and it produced a show. And it was a moderately successful, I mean, you want to do Davenant's proto-operatic Macbeth, you're not going to sell a huge number of tickets. But it was defensible, and it was very, very interesting. The reports I had back from both teams, the research team and the artistic team, were artists and scholars are very different kinds of people. I mean, it's true. I think that as someone who does what I do, the ability to withdraw and be alone for long periods of time is essential. And so scholars build up a certain kind of stamina for being underwater for a long, long, long time. And they don't know what artists do. So I think there's already the dramaturgy lane in Shakespeare's, in presenting Shakespeare and interpreting it. But I would like to see something bigger, where musicians are writing new songs that are part of an app that you've got on your phone that's dramatizing some moment. I mean, there's a beautiful one about Iago that was just done by a company called Juvie, which is essentially a music video, but it's about Iago's appeal, and it's a song, you know. So funding creative work is something we will do. So give artistic fellowships. We're commissioning work. The financial aspect of that is demanding. You need to create new sources of funds to do it. But in general, I would say that from my experience, I do think scholars have a lot to offer. I mean, if you hear Jonathan tell you that Shakespeare invented none of those words, and that linguistically he's a pretty boring writer, you meant it, though. I mean, that's a pretty interesting thing. Or to know that a word that he chose to use had a whole pattern of associations around it, and by the time he used it, when people heard that word, they also thought this, and this. That's very helpful for a theater artist to know. You know, the goat imagery in Othello is all about sexuality, and so is the monkey. And being able to demonstrate that linguistically, which you could do, you know, that's not just a footnote, it's a conversation in a room where you're putting together work. So the other difference is that scholars are not vulnerable in the way that artists are. It's just really clear to me that part of our job is to maintain authority and to use expertise, and artists are throwing themselves into some of the hardest emotional spaces. I mean, the courage involved just astounds me and scares me as a bookish type of person. But I respect it, and I think as we work together, we just need to acknowledge those differences and work together.
That's a great question, thank you. A couple weeks ago, I was part of a workshop at the Newberry called Reactivating 18th Century Restoration Drama, and it was put together by Lisa Freeman, who was part of the Davenant and thought that it was like a life-changing experience for her, and came to the Newberry and wanted to do something. And so we had a workshop that was based on 3 restoration plays, and they had performers from Chicago doing scenes, and those were workshops, and I presented material. So I found the prompt books, Kemble's prompt books from Covent Garden that had them marked up, and we talked about them and their lifespan through the 18th and 19th centuries. It was incredibly fun for me, and I was just sort of on the outside, the periphery of it. People were just so excited and energized by it. We also have fellowships specifically for creatives, for makers, to come in and use a collection. I've worked with book artists and bookmakers for a long time, and I totally agree with the assessment that I would say they struggle to use the library. Some of them have immense amounts of knowledge. They don't know how to search for things or what they look for. They ask for things much differently. They work much differently.
They ask different questions.
And so it's not as easy as just saying, here's a pile of money, come to the Newberry for a month and then write a song.
Yeah.
So the other thing I'll say is I've been really interested in, we've always collected documentation about performance, like even I put up those playbills. I think those are scholarship. I mean, I think, that's a really important part of the archive. It's not just here are some additions. And a couple weeks ago with this restoration drama group, we had a fantastic time looking at, not even very rare, acting editions, they're a dime a dozen in the 18th and 19th century, looking at the differences in them. They found it really useful. I've had really good success in the past couple of years. I've kind of made it my personal project to put book artists and book historians in conversation with one another. It's surprising how little those two groups of people talk to one another. I've had some good experiences with that, some more not so great, but it kind of depends on the personalities. And the other thing that I will end with is I have invited actors in Chicago to come look at the collections, and they're like, yeah, sure, fine. And they don't come. So I would love to do more stuff with them. I'm always up to show material and talk about projects, and people are busy, but it's something that I would love to do more of, whether it's students or theater professionals or both of those things. I think that's an avenue, that's a really rich avenue for the library right now.
Great. Take another question. How about over here? Yeah. Hold on, I'm coming. Sorry, I make you run, Ayana.
Thank you for such a great panel and conversation. I don't want to ask a trick question, but I think I will. It's about the nature of archives. And Mike, you talked about not imagining a world without books. But what about cultures where books aren't the thing that we prioritize? Yeah. And that's not how we keep our cultures alive. So I know what has been the role of places like the Peabody, for example, in their practices of kind of capturing or salvaging indigenous identities. Yeah. So in what ways can these archives be in conversations with communities where it's not extractive, where it's not colonialist, and then also just more broadly, Shakespeare is global. We are in a climate catastrophe. Yep. What is the role for places like the Folger for preserving Shakespeare's history across the globe if we actually do believe that there is more to this writer than just the imperialist arm that took him all over the world?
Oh, what a good question. I'm going to back way out. There was a U.S. Speaker of the House named Tip O'Neill who was famous for saying all politics is local. I kind of feel like all Shakespeare is local. What we talk about as global Shakespeare is in the abstract, but really what's happening is people are performing, interpreting, documenting those things, and they are intensely local activities. So for collections like ours, theater is already a vanishing art, and so there's some parallels with indigenous languages and oral cultures. How do you deal with a norm that is not to capture and document, but to speak and to imagine oneself into the world that is culturally significant by speaking and only speaking? We will face challenges both to engage with those kind of cultural acts. I'm not sure if we have the standing or should be the ones to preserve those acts. I think that because Shakespeare is local, it is each community's choice. But two, with some humility, to say we don't understand yet where this could go, but why don't you lead us in a conversation about this type of knowledge? So that's an incomplete and probably not great answer to your really, really good question. Another one, though, is to just stop burning so much jet fuel. Academia, including this conference, which I'm grateful to be at, is about sending people to different places. Again, thinking about being local. My hope is that in the District of Columbia, which has actually hundreds of different cultures in it, that we have plenty of work to do there. And if you said, well, you're a globally important institution, why aren't you collecting more early modern books? We do have a lot of them. But if you really believe that it's a phenomenon, Shakespeare's more a medium, and people are adapting their practices in all kinds of ways, then, you know, the big challenge is where do you belong? Where do we belong in all of those practices? But specifically saying the local matters feels more important now than it did 5 years ago.
What Mike said. Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think it's also a really difficult question, and I think he's right in talking about, and I think for me, had we gotten actually to the question about Shakespeare and archives in 2050, it's going to be very hyper-local, I think.
Yeah, I agree.
And I think there needs to be a way to then link those collections in new ways and point people towards those collections. The Newberry does have really strong Indigenous collections, and for that, I let my colleagues who work on those collections guide me, and if there was something, you know, in terms of Shakespeare where they came to me and felt it was really important or a really interesting collaboration, I would say absolutely, but I don't, I let them take the reins on that. We've also done programming. In 2016, we did a fantastic program on Indigenous Shakespeare. That was one of the most interesting things that we did that year. That year, I'll also just kind of back up and say, just even thinking about performance and theater in Shakespeare, in 2016, the Chicago Shakespeare Theater put together this absolutely fantastic year of Shakespeare, and it was global, and they brought theater companies in from all over the world and hosted programs all throughout Chicago, and it was really exciting to be a part of that, and that's kind of what I envision as part of like the future of it as well. So Indigenous collections do play a large part of the Newberry. I'm not sure how Shakespeare fits into but it's a question for the it's a question for the future.
So that was a great question, Amberine, and this might be kind of ridiculous, but textuality is a really interesting phenomenon in the West and in the development of Western culture. And textuality is a technology, and technologies produce affordances, but they also produce blocks, and they stop you doing certain things, very often things that you were able to do before. And I think writing and the development of textual culture in the West is a good example of that. And almost everyone in this room has been textualized by the education system and the philosophical system we have, not to recognize what it is we can't do.
Yeah.
And I think one of the interesting things about thinking about digital archives and the digital storage of knowledge is that it actually arguably puts back something we've lost, which is something that oral knowledge hasn't lost. And one of the features of oral, okay, I'm going to...
Go for it, this is really
So one of the features of oral societies and oral knowledge is that it's multidimensional, and you can make links at all kinds of places, and you kind of have wormholes, and you can jump backwards and forwards. One of the features of textual culture is that it is linear. And one of the good things about it being linear is you can check it and you can keep things the same and you can copy. But it makes it very hard to make those jumps and make connections. And that's one of the things that I think textual culture loses. And to me, one of the kind of interesting things is that arguably Shakespeare is writing at a transition point in English culture, and that most of the people around him were illiterate. And that didn't, but a lot of the knowledge around him was actually orally stored. But it very quickly, I mean, you know, it's not just starting in his period, it's been going on for about 100 years at that point, but very quickly, Britain especially becomes a completely textualized culture, with all of the implications for how people treat knowledge that go along with that.
And just to add to this, digital media is pushing us back into an oral culture. It's provisional. It's
back.
Forward. Thank you, Jonathan. And much of the record of what we have, whether they're presidential archives or performances stored on hard disks, will vanish. If you want something to survive, print it on a piece of paper. But starting about 30 years ago, everything we've been recording and stacking up will be gone. And there's no way to keep the copyright on the software that will run that material. The technology will change, bit rot will decay it. So it's kind of interesting that we're actually not in the printed world that we were in.
Right in the middle here. Yeah. Sorry.
I'm so glad you joined us.
I want to thank you for an interesting panel. And I truly enjoyed the words you used at the beginning about the mystique of a book in front of you and how that led you to your careers. I have sort of a technological, mechanical question for you. I'd like to know a number of things about the sharing of archives. We have large archives at the Newberry, at the Huntington, at the Folger, at the Bodleian, wherever. And whether these archives of early modern Europe is being shared, the actual documents are digitally shared, so you have a platform that anyone could access. So I have a question about access. How complete is, well, of course, it'll be changing as discoveries are made, but generally how complete is the digital archive now? Are there a coordination between the various libraries that have archives? Is EBO and READ expanding? Does it have defects which can be cured? And where do you see how complete do you see the digital world of archives being in the world in the year 2050?
Big questions.
Wow. So it kind of depends. I mean, I think the early modern books are much more well documented online through projects like EBO and even like ES, they're much more findable, first of all, because it's a much more known corpus. So I'd say that I think there's still just a number one question we get at the library is like, well, everything's digitized, right? And half the things that are digitized, I can't find them. I will just be honest. Because there's a question too, as Mike said, metadata is hugely important. So a ton of stuff is quote unquote digitized and nobody can find it. Yeah. The archive though, I mean, I hope today I've encouraged people to think about how massive it is and how much out there that so much of what I found for creating Shakespeare was what I call intellectual elbow grease, which is literally turning the pages of magazines or going through family papers. And that stuff isn't anywhere close to being archived. So it kind of depends on what your angle is. If you're early, you have a lot better chance of finding something. But post 1700, I think it sort of, or post 1800, certainly it kind of goes downhill from there.
Yeah, well, Google Books has invested a lot in getting 1800 on, and then it's this big project that Jonathan described for printed books in English, 1470 to roughly 1700, so that you have got a stretch there. But in terms of just brute force access, if you said, I want to give the largest access to these cultural heritage collections so that we can retrieve more facts and experiences from the wide world that they document. If you said that's your goal, you would take pictures of every single page of every single thing, and you'd let a machine learning algorithm start to sort it out. And it won't happen now, but that's a way to do it. It would be irresponsible to use the energy that would be required to sustain that, in my opinion, right now, because I'm not convinced that there would be enough use cases to justify.
But I meant truly to kind of narrow that question down, questions I had as to early modern Europe, say, prior to 1642, let's say.
Yeah.
And how complete that is it evolving? What and goals do you have, and where will it be in the future?
So I can give you some figures. So, and this is just the UK stroke books in English. So EBO, which is Early English Books Online, which is the collection of photographs of rare books, has 300,000 texts in it. And that's 1450 to 1700. But they're just photographs. But it's not every single book, but it's pretty close to every single surviving, a copy of every single surviving book. TCP, which is the transcribed part of that, has around 70,000 texts in it. Now that looks like a much smaller number, but actually most of the texts that are photographed but not transcribed are subsequent editions, so second, third, fourth, fifth editions. So it's actually a very large percentage of the standalone texts, if you like. Then you have to think, okay, there's 300,000 different texts extant in the research libraries of the world in English. What percentage of the books that were actually printed in the period does that represent? That's a kind of tricky figure, because of course something doesn't exist, we don't know, but there are various studies that have been done. It varies a lot depending on genre and type of book, on whether it was a folio, more likely to survive, quarto, less likely to survive. Those estimates vary between 50 and 30%, I think, generally. So maybe we have half, probably less than half, of the books that were actually published. In terms of pamphlets and things like that, the survival rate is massively lower, because ephemera people just didn't keep. So that gives you a bit of a sense of what the situation is like for English. Other European languages, the survival rates are probably, or the digitization rates are much lower. So ProQuest are currently trying to bring together digitized books in various European languages into a form that would seamlessly work with EBO. But the number of texts available in European languages is much smaller, because there hasn't been the kind of focused emphasis on getting text digitized. So English has by far the largest number of texts available. Work is continuing on European languages. But the numbers of texts for most European languages is tiny compared to the number of texts that are available in English. Those books exist. A lot of those books exist in libraries, they just haven't been digitized yet.
Might have time for one more if it's a quick question. How about right there? Oh, sorry.
No, we're coming to you, Peter.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I'm not able to be here tomorrow, so I just wanted to thank everybody involved today for one of the most amazing days I can ever remember. And since memory is a big part of this, I just want to, first of all, say how stimulating, of course. And I would just say, please keep going. Please keep going. This is an amazing first adventure. But do not stop, because people have touched on these things, but for me we're at the threshold of something truly shattering. Obviously, Shakespeare is the pillar number one of white supremacy. From our favorite Chicagoan, Saul Bellow, saying, "Show me the African Shakespeare," on. The inability to look at anything else is a crisis. And it's odd because the man called his theater the Globe. And I think the orality is so crucial. You know, of course, it's important to be obsessed with the text, sure. But the other side of it is, I think when we go back to Shakespeare over and over again, why we're going there, because it's a wisdom tradition. It's actually a search for wisdom and a search for answers that takes you back to Shakespeare. Not that it's the greatest thing in the English language, blah, 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 blah. And the greatness of Shakespeare, of course, is used to shut down all new work for centuries. And that's, all of those things are just regressive and ghastly, and we have to escape them. And the American theater was destroyed by decades of Shakespeare in hit productions where no questions were asked. At the end of the evening, everyone went home just fine. Obviously, we're in a situation where right now there are important questions to ask. And as always, if you want a better answer, ask a better question. Shakespeare, the better questions you ask, the better answers are available. And the answers are all kinds of things: insightful, illuminating, or disturbing, or forcing you back into your own places of doubt and inquiry and crisis, which is really important. And I want to just emphasize from this panel and from this morning, anyone who's looking for something simple, understandable, accessible, whatever, pick another author, please. Because by definition, Shakespeare complicates everything. He says, this is going to be complicated. And then shatters you with a sentence of all one-syllable words, which you kill yourself to try and understand because it's so clear and shattering. For me, the importance of asking these questions now is we're at a time of institutional collapse. Shakespeare has been presented as an institution. It's important we deinstitutionalize him as quickly as possible and deinstitutionalize our own minds. And all these institutions, whether it's the US Congress, the prison industrial system, the current education system, they're all pointed in the wrong direction and have calcified at a nightmare place where it's almost impossible to deconstruct them, and yet the damage is unbelievable. One of the beauties of Shakespeare is no sets, no costumes. Come on, let's get some people together and work on something. It doesn't depend on an institution for its existence. It's actually an invitation. It's pre-professional. It's that, of course, the most powerful Shakespeare you ever saw in your life, you saw in a prison. You saw in a high school. You saw in a place where people were grappling with something and where the consequences were life and death, not smug self-satisfaction. Okay, right now we do have the conditions of life and death. Can we place these plays again in their proper context, which was to ask the largest questions of the people who are responsible? For me, COVID came as an invitation to just get out of our theaters, to actually invest in every single space as performative, to invest in every single place where people gather as performative, and to actually begin to share this beautiful thing of Shakespeare, which, as somebody said earlier, is totally a passport. It's totally a, what did you say, passport and a Trojan horse, but also a portal that we've all had to pass through in some way, and so it's actually familiar landscape. And to work inside that landscape in very creative ways, reimagining and rebuilding it together, and also taking it apart and not saying, oh, well, he's not perfect. Well, duh, of course. But in fact, again, the shortcomings and our own shortcomings are what we're all coming up against. So can we use Shakespeare as a creative moment in this very trying human passage that we're living through, that the entire earth is threatened. And what it means to talk to another human being has to be reestablished. These plays are in dialogue. They are about dialogue. And so every single way we engage them has to be about dialogue with the plays and with each other, not with an absolute single point of this is the correct interpretation, this is the correct meaning of this word, etc., etc., etc. And I have to say, one of the most beautiful experiences I had in my life that Barry a bit referenced, when I went to do Merchant of Venice in Chicago years ago. At that time, there were only 2 white people in the cast. I wanted, of course, the judge has to be white always, and Old Gobo, of course, is a serious racist, and his kid, Lancelot. But I asked African-American performers to perform all the roles of the Jews. The Venetians were Latino, and Portia and her rich friends were all Asian Americans, and I was coming right from the LA uprising. And I wanted to do an economic picture of Los Angeles at that moment when the city was burning. And the first thing we did 2 beautiful things. One is we read a series of sacred books and philosophy books and economics books and interspersed those texts with Shakespeare. 1 line of Shakespeare, 1 line of Manning Marable and How Capitalism Underdeveloped Black America. And go back and forth and just have another line of Shakespeare, another line of, the Bible saying, Jesus, the young man asking Jesus, why he, what it takes to have eternal life. And Jesus says, well, sell all you have and give it to the poor, and then you'll be fine. And then the famous line, and that young man went away sad, for he had great possessions. And of course, the opening line of Merchant of Venice is, I know not why I am so sad. To take all these sacred books and take all the economic texts and historical texts and just interlace them with Shakespeare, do the open veins of Latin America and another line of Shakespeare, and just keep these plays alive with their company. What's the context? What's around them? What's moving through them? What's speaking through them? And then the next week, we spent the entire week going through the play. We had 17 actors, and we stopped at every line, and we went around the table, and actors from all over the world and all over different parts of America and different neighborhoods and different economic realities. So, okay, when you hear that line, what does that line awaken in you? That question of how hard it is to understand a Shakespeare line. And people went around the room and just, everyone had a completely different understanding of what that line could mean. And started to share very personal experiences. And by the end of the week, that play contained a human library of experience from 17 completely different people. So you became aware as you were entering a scene that you were saying a line, and the person you were saying to heard something totally different from what you imagined you were saying. For me, the richness of Shakespeare is that stuff. And the more we can use the archive, and in fact invite the archive to become very creative in the sense of Toni Morrison and Saidiya Hartman's writing into the archive, because the archive was made when most of humanity was not declared to be a human being. So we have to not only enjoy the archive and be grateful for it, but we have to challenge it the same way we have to challenge Shakespeare. And it's all of us are our better selves once we are challenged.
I can't think of a better way to conclude this panel. Thank you so much. And thank you please join me in thanking our lovely panelists for their amazing comments today.